Did you want to say it?
Good morning. It looks like a few more people are still trickling in, but we'll get going today. Thank you all for being here, whether you're here because you normally come, or you're here because you're in our new member class, or you're just coming because you're interested in hearing a little bit more about stewardship. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go, but first I want us just to have a little bit of time in conversation. So I invite you to turn to somebody around you, get into smaller groups, and we're going to talk about two questions to start. First, share what is an important gift that you've received. It's kind of an open question. Answer it as you see fit. And then second, who has taught you directly or indirectly about finances and practices of giving? What did you learn or absorb from them? So let's take about 5 minutes or so to chat about those in small groups.
So many. So the first one
I have one child. I don't like that anymore. The other so much. What's a part of you? Did dancing when she was
Testing.
You guys in the group? Okay.
So good morning. For those of you that just came in, just jump in with somebody else. We're going to be talking in small groups about the questions on the screen.
all right.
Good morning. Your house? Yeah, we For me, that was my big part. I would say my for me. Yeah, right. Stewardship. There's not a whole lot you can do. Very good. Sister's younger than me, already gone. Yeah.
We did that because my mom had us do that. We just raised 25 cents of our allowance. So I wanted to be like a quarter of our allowance. So I said, well, envelopes are like this big. Yeah.
In the years and years ago, they had Rector Center. Yeah. And these are much more and then she takes
I still write a check. You know, my first year was what happened. You know, I had 100 gold bucks.
From my aunt, she was in
We were diagnosing now, because I was looking into it, and then you have accounts that we because that's how we started making you know, I show them what's happening. It's different than like separating it, but they still know whether it's that, you know, and allowance. Yeah, I was thinking that's yeah, it's different.
Yeah, and I worry about that because, well,
Yeah.
and I think you might have that in, I'll just say, but in your face kind of
when they
thing.
decided
Right.
to, in 1935, for the Social Security Act, people that were born before that, was born in 1910, they said they should get so much money for Social Security pay.
Past summer, our son
We're giving them too much. We have to reduce it.
Some places,
So when people were born between 1910
so then we said, okay,
they reduced it, but they reduced it too much.
it's all done for you. But at the same time,
Scheduled it and
they were writing down, you know, like, when you start moving, you have to write it down.
but he made Social Security. I asked Congressman Sensenbrenner, maybe he was a congressman. He said, I can give you a political answer, I can tell you the truth. He said, the truth is it would cost so much money. He said, that we can't afford it. And he says, it's sad. And he says, my fellow colleagues have to say, these people who did what he's
Anyway, I was old at that point. I remember if I was married. So, I mean, if you kind of but I got the buck to buy a car.
I like that because he was an honest, straight guy. It changed our church.
And it really,
When it replaced him,
the way I was brought up,
he's not ours anymore. They changed, redistricted.
you don't really, I didn't see the car. That's where I stuck to
When more.
it. It kind of happened.
I actually drove on the 4th of July parade.
I still owed on the other side. And they probably would have made it or whatever. I mean, they say it's really.
It was a different woman. But Chris Cameron,
I can't.
to Jackie's place. She had a halfway house for men that had been in prison. She was at straighten them out. She said the only guys I don't know. She says, but everything else that they do.
So is everybody sharing me another minute or two? How are we doing on time? So small. Look, if you're good. Let's come back together as a large group now. So this little feedback can help get your attention. I usually like, with the confirmation students, I'll say clap if you can hear me, but I guess if I just like talk and echo a little bit, you can hear me too this way. So I'm curious, what did you talk about, like in terms of like lessons you've been told over the years about giving and generosity? Who's taught you? What have you learned over time? Yeah, yes, Tom?
The lesson I learned was from Jesus.
Yeah.
He said to his disciples, he said, when I was in prison, you visited me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was hungry, you fed me. He said, we haven't seen you in prison or hungry or naked. He said, what you do for the least of my brothers, you do for me. I was concerned about the least, but then I realized who he showed mercy to. The blind, the lame, people, one who was paralyzed, and this has stayed with me.
Thank you, Don. Yes, Jesus has a lot to say about it. That's one of the reasons we're talking about it today. Thank you. Yes, Robert?
Yes, everything, I feel what I have is a gift, but it comes with an awesome responsibility to be a good steward of what I've been given.
Absolutely. Yeah. I swear that you two are not plants, but that's what we're talking about. Everything we've been given are gifts, and it comes with responsibility. Are there any other lessons we've learned over time? Yes, Mary?
One thing my parents taught me was that you give to the Lord first.
Yes.
That comes off at the top of your check or whatever. And I've done that my whole life. I just take it off the top end in a separate account or line. And my dad was a working school teacher, so we never had very much money, but we always had enough. And it's been my life too.
Great, thank you, Marion. So give to Lord first, absolutely. Yes, Andy?
For me, I was sharing that I hadn't come to church until I was an adult, and so it was a lot more of a tougher lesson when Pastor Margaret told us in our new member class about this idea of tithing, and I was like, that's a tough lesson when you're an adult, But
It is.
But in hearing other people who I met were Christians and had the way they built it into their budget, it was like, okay, it hit my heart, right? So it was a tougher lesson as an adult than it was. Something you learn as a young child.
Yeah, I think there's a challenge to it regardless of age.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, Petey?
My story's a lot like Maryland's, except my parents are Norwegian, so they never talked
Yeah.
about it.
Much of anything.
I always saw them writing the check on Sunday morning.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate you all starting to talk a little bit. The immediate silence at first, I think, also is instructive too. It's like, this isn't something we talk about a lot, certainly not openly. It's one of those like off-topic subjects often. So we're going to be, for the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to be courageous, I think, in sharing openly about kind of some questions with money and what this has to do with our faith and what our faith has to do with money and all that. So thank you for being here today and for your thoughts. It was fun hearing you chat at your tables. Do you have something to say?
I just wanted to share that I was talking with Julie.
I'm happy to say it.
Oh, you say it.
Well, I said in the group that my parents stressed that when you got your paycheck, the first thing they did was took out the money, 10%. You start with 10%, and then you go up from there. But you take it out right away. I mean, you designate that. And we never went hungry.
What I thought was interesting, though, is that your parents would say, this goes to the Lord.
Yeah.
Like they wouldn't say, I'm going to write a check to the church, right? It was,
This is the
this
Lord's
is for the
money.
Lord.
Yeah, that's great. Again, I swear you're not plants. This is great. You could be teaching this class. Thank you. Yes, Jim?
Well, and my experience was similar. Saturday night, we got our allowance, everybody, and then we had little Sunday school giving envelopes, for children, size, and 10%. My dad taught about 10% of your allowance goes into that envelope first.
Yeah, that's neat. Thanks for sharing. Those lessons we learned as kids can really stick with us. Yeah, and I appreciate all that you're saying. We're talking about stewardship today, and it's interesting that often in practice, like what Pastor Ann was pointing to, that stewardship tends to mean the Christian use of money and giving to the church. And yes, I mean that's in practice often how it plays out, but as much as possible, let's take that and kind of put that aside, because what I'm hoping we're going to talk about for the next 45 minutes or so is the use and care of God's gifts. Since all that we have is a gift from God, and how do we tend to all that we have? So that's kind of the guiding question for us today, more than how much money are you going to give to the church. I think that's ultimately a less interesting and I think a secondary question too. What do we do with all that God has given us? So the way this is going to work, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the Bible. Probably heard of that thing. Then we're going to turn and talk about the small catechism. So what Martin Luther, St. Matthew's Evangelical Lutheran Church, what the namesake of our tradition, has to say about these matters. So first, we're going to go into Matthew chapter 6, where Jesus is talking to his disciples about giving here. And he tells them, it's a little bit small here, I'm sorry, I should have made the font a little bit bigger. Beware of practicing your righteousness before others in order to be seen by them, for then you have no reward from your Father in heaven. So whenever you give alms, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be praised by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward. But when you give alms, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your alms may be done in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Turn to your groups again that you were just chatting with, and can you explain in your own words at your group what Jesus is saying here? Let's take about 2 or 3 minutes to do that, to paraphrase what Jesus is saying here.
Part of giving is
Right? And the people were
so part of giving is
giving their money like this. Just about not being showy, not bragging, not letting anyone know what
Motivation.
And I think that's a good one, because I know people.
I think, your perspective is that everything is a gift. And it all comes from God anyway. You're just giving back. But you're right. You're just giving back to God, which was God. How much I thought you and that's the thing too, which is but I think it's about you want to make sure everybody's doing that's not as great. And you're doing it for themselves, not for God. Isn't just the age will probably still money to go I know I talked to her.
Let's talk for about 15 more seconds. Close up the thought you're at, then let's come back together as a large group.
Do not have your left hand.
She would never.
So what are some things you chatted about in your small groups there? Like, if you were to put this in your own words, what do you think Jesus is talking about here?
Okay, I have a confession to make, that I have a real hard time when people endow a university for $10 million.
Oh yeah.
Because I always sit back, and I'm a pure capitalist, I will admit that, but I always sit back and think, did they deserve to make that money in the first place?
Yeah.
Should they have made that much money on
Absolutely.
a business, and then are they such great people because now they gave away more money than most of us would ever earn in a lifetime? But that's,
Absolutely.
Is that what this is about, or is that just me being a bad person?
Absolutely. Gosh, that is a great question about the discomfort about endowing, with these huge gifts to universities, both how people gave that money, and then also how it's seemingly this kind of showing off moment of generosity as well.
You get a name on
They
it.
got a name on the building, yeah. There's a little kind of quid pro quo there.
There must be real incentive though, because there are these naming rights for individual rooms as well as whole buildings.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It must encourage people.
I actually see it a little different in the private sector than I do in the church, but there was a discussion at a church we belonged to at one point in time, whether it's if people they could get a plaque on the wall or something like that. Ultimately, we concluded that wasn't what God meant. But it was bad enough that we had the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, there's this tension there. Yeah, Trudy?
Well, on the other hand, if people are encouraged to donate to the church, they might just as well have said, well, I think I'm going to support the Nature Conservancy or the ballet or something. So I think there are business practices involved here in order to have people pay attention to the church.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
Our group talked a little bit about the people who you find out at church end up giving more money and end up having more of a say, and how much of a balancing act for a pastor, because the pastor's salary comes from, our tithes and donations, and you don't want to necessarily make those people mad where they just leave, but that isn't the point to give into whoever has the most money gets the most say. That's kind of what our group ended up talking about.
Well, that was kind of one reason they kept that earlier church, like the 7 o'clock church, wherever it was, going, because most of those were big donors to the church, and so they wanted to cut it out. And finally they did. But that was the reason it was continued to exist for many years.
Yeah, you're pointing to this one challenge in church life of trying to live as God calls us, but also just the practical financial realities. That there's this tension there that we live in this world how do we best hold these things in tension? I hope that today kind of a takeaway from this, like you've been pointing at, is that we give not primarily because it feels good to get recognized or even to get our voice heard, maybe in church or at a university, but because we believe that that's in obedience to God, that God instructs us and calls us to be generous. And also we do it for the sake of our neighbor. Like if we're giving to a university, ideally not to have our names on a building, but so that the next generation of students can get a good education, for instance. And with that, I think this ties nicely into what Jesus says just a little bit later, where he says, don't store your treasures up on earth where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. What do we think Jesus means about treasure on earth and treasure in heaven? What makes these things different? Talk about that at your groups for a couple minutes.
I remember the parable about the rich man who had Lazarus living at his gate, and he would eat the scraps off the table. So then both of them, correct me if I'm going wrong. So both of them died, right? And the poor beggar is in heaven, and the rich guy is in hell. But there's a conversation going on between the people in heaven and the people in hell. So the rich man says, basically, what can I do to get there? And the answer is, you have to choose. So I'm missing something here going on.
what whether they're valuable, you know, have value.
I find myself curious at my age. I'm alone. And I'm worried. I have a lot of fun stuff, and I say that's for someone to take care of. I mean, there's this balance. I don't want to be
There's nothing wrong with it. It's just that we each can look at each other's lives.
I'm sorry. I don't want to be in the government. It's hard for some people. It's hard to question.
Brings this up a lot. Men's Bible study, we talk about, you know, what we just talked about as far as give up your poor man that rich man.
We knew what you meant.
I want to give everything away, but we're still planning on, you know, we're still planning on being here for another 2 decades. So we just never know how much is too much.
So let's come back together as a large group. There's a lot to be said, and you know, plenty more to be said than I gave you time for, but just hopefully that was just a little kind of sampling for this. I'm intrigued and want to reflect a little bit on this final sentence. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Last March, about a year and a half ago, my family bought a new car. It was the first car we bought in our marriage. Both of our cars that we had, you know, my wife and I brought into our marriage. And a few months in, our car got its first ding in it. And I wasn't driving it at the time. But you know what? Like, it was frustrating in a way that it wouldn't have been for that old car that we had. It's like, oh shoot, we have money invested in this thing. Now I'm kind of mad. And when Jesus says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. That's not like, he's not making a moral statement or giving us instructions on how to live. He's just making a statement of fact there. That what we have our money in, our heart follows that. Kind of like, I don't think of myself as a car person, but I put money into that car, and so I care about it now. And that doesn't just apply for my car, that applies for wherever we spend our money. That if we put money into things perhaps generously pertaining to the poor, maybe that'll change our heart's relationship with those causes as well.
Did you get it fixed?
No. No. Nope, I did not get it fixed. And I'm not driving that car today, so you can't go look in the parking lot and try to find it. And so this next passage from 2 Corinthians, I almost wish I brought up a little bit earlier in our conversation about churches that are needing to get enough money. And what do? Do we make sure that we give people the pastor's ear, or do we put their names on the wall? This is kind of a dynamic that's happening in the early church here. So Paul writes a letter to the church in Corinth. This is 2 Corinthians. And he's talking here about what's going on in the church in Jerusalem. The church in Jerusalem has fallen on hard times. The church in Corinth is doing a little better financially. And so Paul is asking the church in Corinth to help out, to give here. And what he says about giving here, I think, is really interesting and instructive. He starts by saying, the point is this: the one who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and the one who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. So what he's saying here, be generous. And it's the more you give, the more you're going to get out of it. So he's saying, please, please be generous. But he also says, each of you must give as you have made up your mind, not regretfully or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. He's like, please give. I'm not going to force you or tell them out, but please be generous here. And God is able to provide with every blessing and abundance, so that by always having enough of everything, you may share abundantly in every good work. So please be generous. Not going to tell you how much to do, and God provides. And then he keeps on going from there. I didn't get all 10 verses on that first slide. God who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase harvest of your righteousness. Paul's continuing to talk about how God provides, God provides, God provides. Then you will be enriched in every way for your generosity. God even provides a gift for those that are generous, which will produce thanksgiving to God for us. For the rendering of this ministry not only supplies the needs of the saints, but also overflows with many thanksgivings to God. So when Paul is saying, the church in Jerusalem needs money, help us out. You're going to provide for the church in Jerusalem, the needs of the saints. But it's also a gift of thanksgiving to God. So it's always both. It's a gift to the church, but fundamentally and primarily and under that, it's a gift of thanksgiving to God. And God will provide. God has provided. God will continue to provide. So it's interesting to me here that Paul's talking really openly about money and saying, please help out. We need money here. And yet us, Midwestern Lutherans, as Pastor Ann mentioned in her sermon, don't like talking about money a whole lot. I'm curious, if the Bible talks so much about money and money-related issues, why do you think we talk about so many other things about money before we talk about money? Why is money such a seemingly off-topic conversation if the Bible is so interested in it? If Jesus actually says more about money than about prayer, why don't we talk about that more? What do you think? Talk about that in your groups for a couple minutes.
Hold on, just 1 second, please. I'm going to invite the congregation members to do some musical chairs. And if you don't mind standing up and finding new members, you can stay seated, you get kids, you look comfortable. But maybe St. Matt's members could do some circulating. And so maybe stand up and find someone else to talk with. This is Matt and Katie and Eloise and Matt and Rachel, and Michael is in the back, and then Dylan left, and he'll be back. Okay. So it'd be great if you got up and Charlene get up and find someone else to talk to on this question. Please.
You sit here, man.
I get over here.
You were with that one before, right?
No, he was back in.
Oh, you were in the room?
Yeah, those.
We're double names.
Yeah, we can a lot of videos.
Like double
I could kind of split up
So 4 members and 1 new guy.
Well, I'm sort of new. I've been here about 6 months. Oh, that's good. I'm not a stranger.
I've been here 4 years.
Okay. Maybe about 14. I'm getting, I'm going to catch up to you. I'm about 14 years.
And you've been here how many years?
19.
Well, you take your case.
So, we're actually,
communication.
I was born in that.
Actually,
I was born and raised and baptized and confirmed at St. John's, which is Wisconsin. And but my daughter actually brought us here because the youth minister took a call and they didn't have anybody for the kids. So one of her friends at high school said, well, I go to St. Matthew's, why don't you come there? Pastor Chris takes us skiing and we do this. So she came here and she liked it. So she talked to us. And when my mother passed away, I moved over here because she would have nothing about me leaving St. John's. That would never work.
She was there since childhood?
She and her 9 brothers and sisters
Let's go for about
were
30 seconds.
confirmed there.
Wrap up with this final person and come back
Guys, for the question.
It was, why does the Bible, why does it talk about money when the Bible?
Well, I think there's a mixed message because it talks about how rich Jewish people would, basically show off how much they are. So there's a sense that you should be more humble. And money is more quietly talked about than the spiritual things that are talked about. And that's how I...
Yeah, he talked about, the things he talked about were the elders praying in the streets where everybody could see how religious they were, or, giving money and coming up, and so everybody could see how important and how generous they were. It was for show. Sure, they gave money, but they wanted...
about giving money, they were always just, giving whatever you got in your pocket.
Let's come back together as a large
organized approach.
But then
good to hear you all talk, and there's a lot to be said about this curious reality that Jesus talks about money. The Bible talks about money so much that we seem kind of uncomfortable to do so. I know you all have a lot of good thoughts. It was fun kind of eavesdropping on your conversations. I'm going to share 2 reflections on this real briefly. The first reflection is I grew up in the Presbyterian church, but I grew up kind of in the kind of more like evangelical wing of that. And one of the other churches that was kind of in a similar evangelical wing of that was kind of the Presbyterian church, when I was in college, so after I moved out, decided they were going to leave the Presbyterian church, and on account, basically this was right after the sexuality issue hit the Presbyterian church. And my parents were very emphatic to explain to me, this is not some sort of anti-gay statement that this other church is making. This is strictly a question about how seriously we take the Bible. And me being a kind of, a difficult young adult or teenager, I think I was still a teenager at the point, said, well, let's go see what the Bible actually says, and started reading the Bible a lot more on this. Didn't want to even confront that question, what the Bible actually says on homosexuality, but I did find very quickly the Bible says a lot about money that I kind of doubted that church was following, because they were in a very, very affluent area and had a lot of money at that church. I was like, okay, do we only follow the Bible when it's convenient for us? So I think that one part of this is, why do we need to talk about it? I think it's because Jesus talks about it, and it's kind of central to our faith. And then a second reason I think it's important to talk about, I'm going to share 2 books I've read recently. I'm going to do a little bit of a brief book report on these 2 books. Both of these books are written by fancy Ivy League named professors. This guy is a professor of, I think, comparative literature at Yale. This guy is a professor of linguistics at Columbia. They're both kind of public intellectual type people. They're also both pretty avowed atheists. As you can imagine in this title, How a New Religion Has Betrayed Black America. This guy is even the title is pretty anti-religion. This is about what can secular faith look like. And so both of these books start by being very suspicious of religious and faith claims as traditionally conceived of. This guy thinks that trying to talk about the infinite and eternity is a problem. The guy on the right says basically sticking to faith commitments is a bad thing. So the guy on the right, his line of reasoning is that critical race theory, the guys like Ibram Kendi are turning anti-racism into a religion. Religion is bad, we shouldn't do that. Without making a value judgment on both of these books, I found ultimately both of their critiques not especially interesting to me, or not as good as what I would thought a named professor from an Ivy League school could come up with. What's interesting to me is they both spend the first half of their books criticizing kind of these like religiosity as we know it. In the second half, they start making constructive statements about what they think we should do again. What if the good life isn't found in faith? What is it found in? And they both talk about money. Martin Haglund, as you can probably tell from his name, is Nordic. He's from Sweden. And he's like democratic socialism, post-capitalism, this kind of like Nordic socialist state, that's where the good life is found. Then John McWhorter starts by saying, well, being a linguist, he goes, well, we need to teach phonics. So it's like, okay, that's kind of funny, you're a linguist. But then he starts talking about class a lot. So basically, the way that we get to the problems of society aren't figured out by religion, they're figured out by talking about money. And so I think one of the reasons our faith has to engage these things is because these are where, like, in public circles, talking about what does a good life and a good society look like, it's conversations about money. And if we as the church want to be a part of that, we have something to say as well, I think, on that. So that's why I think this is an important thing to talk about. And now to talk about that, I think our faith, not only in the Bible, which we talked about, has resources, but also in the Catechism, one of the core teaching documents of our church. So Martin Luther, who wrote this, namesake of our church, is reflecting on the Apostles' Creed, which we recited this Sunday, and if you're coming at 11, you'll recite too. When we say, I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, Luther says that means we believe that God has given us everything that we have, and also provides things like shoes and clothing and food and drink, house and farm, spouse and children, livestock, property, all the necessities and nourishment for life. So when Luther says, when we're talking about I believe in God, we're saying I believe God provides for us. And so Luther, and in our tradition, has a history of talking about money, connected with our faith. And so I'm curious, can you turn to those around you for about 2 minutes? And if we understand that everything we have is a gift from God, like what Luther talks about, we're saying when we recite the creed, how does that affect how we use all that we have? Talk about that. Like, what if we act like basically when we say this, what difference does this make for us? If this is how we think about it when we're reciting the creed. Talk about that in your groups for like 2 minutes now.
Who goes first? That's always the tough.
Here's the Bible expert right here.
Shoes come from God.
We're not going to take anything.
Or all the things that I know.
Thankfulness because
Well, I think he endows people with creativeness. Somebody created the shoes that you wear, someone created the watch I've got, someone created the idea of building an automobile. I mean, it's something, God gives you a certain talent, a certain ability. I think that's kind of what this is all about. Everything we have is because God gave someone the ability to make it, to conceive the idea of having something like that.
But all those material things become habit forming, and then you suddenly become more materialistic because, oh, I like your shoes. Where'd you get those? I'm going to get them. Or, what are you driving now? See, it's a Lexus. I drive Lexus. Whatever. So all these things take you away from the Spirit.
You start worshiping your feet.
Yes.
rather than God. But it's a little bit conflicted in my head, because what about those that have not by their choice, by their has God abandoned them? Are they not worthy?
Well, the people in war-torn Israel and Gaza, and Lebanon, their lives are ruined daily. People in Florida who had a peaceful existence in paradise, and the hurricane comes and they have nothing.
I remember you talked about that when my cousin's grandson passed away. He was only 16, but he was special needs. And we went to the funeral, and I bumped into the pastor, Larry, and I was like him. I gave some of the best sermons I ever heard. I said to him, I said, you know, Pastor, I said, the disciples argued who would be sitting at Jesus' right hand. I said, but you know, when you think of who he had mercy on, I said, children like this are gathered around him. And these two vicars are sitting there rolling their eyes, and he looked at me and said, Don, he said, I think you're absolutely right.
What was the right thing
That God will eventually care for someone like this and give them a special place.
So we shouldn't worry about the lack of missed opportunity.
But the thing of it, he was taken care of by his brothers and sisters and his mother and father. And I remember there was a girl at St. Matthew's here, and she's in some care now. She couldn't even speak. All she could do was make noise. I think you know who I'm talking about. But her mother would bring her. She would hear the word of God, which to me, that was important, because I don't know how her thinking was, but she will be one of the special people that God will take with him, to him.
So what you need is a system that you take care of all of this, and of course the church is such a system where you have all kinds of categories that will allow you to care for people. But if you need a bigger system, governmental system, you can have socialism.
So that's one guy was talking about Hagler, that democratic socialism is the way to go because everybody's happy.
Right, so you can take care of them in a more broad sense. In other words, you're looking at our means to care for all the people at church.
Okay, let's come back together as a large group. You have a
But
lot
we
of
also
good
have a
things to
spiritual
say.
one.
I
We're looking at
enjoyed
people's
listening to you
spiritual
all in your
life
small groups,
versus
reflecting on how thinking of all we have as a gift from God affecting how we use it. And it's interesting to me, too, that Luther says this when we recite the Creed, this is what we're talking about. Then a little bit later in the Small Catechism, when he's talking about the Lord's Prayer, when we say, give us today our daily bread, he goes, well, daily bread, and we're asking for daily bread. We're asking for the necessities and nourishment of our bodies, food, drink, clothing, shoes, house, farm, fields, livestock, money, property, an upright spouse, which I think is kind of funny that he's really trying to give an expansive definition here. That bread isn't just bread. Bread is all the things that make life good. Upright and faithful rulers, good government, good weather, peace, health, decency, honor, good friends, faithful neighbors, etc. So that when we're talking about daily bread and what we're asking for God, we're not just asking for like a spiritual thing. We're asking for everything that makes life worth living. Yeah, continue to reflect on that afterwards. I'd love to hear you chat about that later.
He was influenced by the price of those indulgences.
Yeah, maybe he was influenced by those indulgences. Yeah, and so for the last few minutes, what I want us to do is we're going to have a little bit of fun. We're going to play a game here. What do we think? Should we do... Let's do this side versus this side. So we're going to do a little quiz show. I'm going to ask multiple choice questions, and I just want a volunteer from each table, from each side. If you feel confident, raise your hand and try and give me the answer. Then we're going to reflect on these questions. Don't raise your hand until I've read the entire question, though. So I'm not going to call on you until I've read the whole question. First, everything we have comes from God, except the successes we built through hard work and personal determination, except what the economy provides, except the security we get from financial planning, or no exceptions.
No
exceptions. No exceptions, yes. Like hard work, personal determination, economy provides, the security we get from financial planning. All good things, like all have a human part in things that we get. But at the end of the day, ultimately, we believe that it all comes from God, and God's grace is, is behind all that we have, even the things that we strive for. Next, so there you go, D, no exceptions. And I don't know if I earlier on I gave you a little bit of a definition of stewardship. Let's see if you can remember this. Stewardship is A, overseeing financial investments, B, another way of saying giving money to the church, C, the use and care of God's gifts, or D, managing resources for personal gain. Yes. C, let's see, is that what I was hoping for?
Yeah.
Yes, perfect. Yeah, often, stewardship, you can maybe overseeing financial investments or giving money to the church or managing resources for personal gain. Yeah, maybe that's kind of like a secondary thing, but it's really primarily stewardship is what we do with God's gifts. How about this one? Because I've heard us talk about tithing a lot today. So, Jesus teaches his followers what should they do with their money. Should they give it all away? Maybe this is a test to see if you listen to this sermon today. B, give half of it away. C, give a tithe, 10% of it away, or none of the above. What do we think? Yes?
A.
A? Yeah, I think I think that's a fair answer based on what we've heard today. He says give it all away, but he also never really makes a normative statement of going, you always have to give it all away. I would say that I think A is a good answer. I think that we can also say none of the above. That really he tells one guy this, but at the end of the day, he never says, hey, you better give half or 10%. The point of it is to give courageously and generously and faithfully. 2 more questions. Giving can mean several different things. Which meaning is not correct? A, giving is an act of worship. B, giving can help us earn salvation. C, giving is a way to help your neighbor. Or D, giving is a way of drawing closer to God. Yes, Don?
C.
So you think that giving can mean everything but helping your neighbor? Is that what you were thinking? It's a negative in there.
Oh, no. Giving can mean several different things, which meaning, is not correct. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I saw a second hand up here. Yes?
B.
B, yes.
Yeah.
This is remember you were talking about indulgences. This isn't the way to get yourself to heaven here, but it can be worship. It can maybe even draw us closer to God. It can help us build trust and faith in God. It definitely can help our neighbor, but it's not going to get you salvation. So I think now what we have is we have 2 on this side, 2 on this side. We have a final tie-breaker question here. There's going to be a true or false question. We give church primarily to pay the church's bills. True or false? I didn't shout out false. False. Perfect. We do not give primarily to pay the church's bills. We do this as an act of obedience and faith in God. And that's probably part of the reason why Jesus never says, X%, you better give that, because if that was the case, then it's just like that would be thinking about in terms of an accounting question for the church. But really, it's about how do we obey and have faith in God. So that's good. You all are doing really good here. Now I have one final question for the final 3 minutes, and I'm not gonna call us back together as a large group after this. I'm just gonna have you talk about this for a few minutes. When your conversation is done, you can head off, whether that's going to the 11 o'clock service or heading home or doing something else in entirety. So turn back to those groups that you've had, that you've been with most recently, and I want you to share what's one thing you've learned today, and also share what questions do you still have. So talk about that in your group for the next 3 or so minutes. It is 10:42.
Stewardship has something to do with generosity. My talked about what questions you still have. As far as I'm concerned, stewardship involves a system. And there was no special system, there was no discussion in the system is where you take a look at what you've got and what needs on your side.
So you could remember that, but
What the outlay should motivate for various kinds of things.
Absolutely, and that also points to that.
People have. And so I use the highlight section that says, when somebody comes and knocks on your door and says, I'm here to collect money for the pension fund, if that was not on your list of priorities as to establish at the beginning of the year, there's nothing in the pot for that. Because if I just willy-nilly give away to everybody who comes to my door or knocks at the cash register when I'm in the grocery store, I don't have anything left to give away. So I think there needs to be a system.
Plan, a budget.
Absolutely.